All right, so yesterday we talked about the layers of the earth and different landforms. Today we're going to talk about the processes that actually make those things happen. How do those landforms even form? So, just as a reminder, we're not doing the guided notes one day, independent practice the next day. Instead, we're doing like a review blitz for that MAAP test. So, we're going to do a short, teeny tiny review, and then you're going to do a short, teeny tiny independent practice over what we're talking about. And since today is Friday, we're not going to do a bell ringer though. We do have an exit ticket. So, we'll get to that later. But first, let's talk about the different processes that make up the earth. We can have a constructive process where parts of the earth is literally being built up, or we can have the opposite, which is a destructive process where the earth is being destroyed or broken down. Hopefully this kind of rings a bell to you. We get this stuff pretty easily, so we won't spend too much time on it. So different types of constructive processes is that seafloor spreading or that deposition. Destructive processes are going to be weathering, erosion, and earthquakes, and some can be both. So sometimes landslides, floods, or volcanic eruptions can be both. So again, you can think of like construction work. When you hear the word construction, that's when you're actually building up something. So that's constructive or destructive. We know if we're destroying something or if you are being destructive, you are literally breaking something apart, like this bird knocking down this pile of cups or whatever. So that's a pretty easy way to remember the difference. I think we kind of got down a lot of these. Like, we know that earthquakes are destructive. It's literally breaking apart the earth. So we won't really review that as much. I'm going to focus more on the things that maybe we struggle with a little bit more or they're tricky to remember. So looking at those constructive processes, which are again those processes that are going to build up or create new pieces of earth. First, we talked about that seafloor spreading. And we're going to talk about this more when we get to those actual plate boundaries, when we review those good stuff. But first, seafloor spreading, all that is when we are creating new crust, which is that top layer of the earth. We talked about that yesterday, along those mid-ocean ridges, which are those big mountain ranges that are underneath the ocean. So what happens is those tectonic plates, they separate, or the seafloor literally spreads apart, just like it's called. They separate, and hot magma from the asthenosphere will actually come out of the earth and harden to form a new solid rock. So new crust is being created, which causes that mid-ocean ridge or that underwater mountain to even occur. So the plates separate underneath the sea floor, that new magma comes up and hardens, so you're creating more crust. So this is constructive. Another one that I think is a little bit tricky is that deposition. Deposition. So that is the laying of sediment, which we remember sediment is sand, dirt, clay, silt, all that good stuff is being moved into a new location. So this can be like, let's say a flood comes along, when you have a long or a large amount of water coming through, it can pick up certain sediment and drop it off in a new spot. So since you're adding more sediment into an area, you are literally building up the earth. So that is also constructive. I know I'm going through this a little bit quickly, just so we can get to the independent practice and also because we've seen this stuff before, but go ahead, pause it if you need to, rewind, hit me up if you need any of this stuff like extra broken down for you. That's what I'm here for. Another thing that is constructive can be volcanic eruptions. We know what it is when a volcano erupts, but I think thinking about this as a constructive process is where it gets a little bit tricky because we know how it can be destructive because that magma or that lava can come up and literally burn parts of the earth, like melt it down. So that is a way a volcanic eruption can definitely be destructive. It can be constructive or build up the earth if the volcanic eruption happens underneath ocean water. So believe it or not, there are volcanoes that live underneath the ocean water, kind of crazy. And when it erupts or that hot magma comes out of the volcano, if it cools enough and hardens at the ocean or at the top of the ocean water, that is creating an island. So not all islands form that way, but a lot of them are. They're actually solid magma from a volcanic eruption. Kind of crazy. So that is a way it can be constructive. If that magma comes up and hardens to form a island. Now, when we're talking about destructive, I know this looks like a lot. Don't worry, it's not. We're going to break it down. When we're looking at destructive, the one thing that is super important, and I know they're going to ask you about this on the MAAP test, is that weathering and erosion. Weathering and erosion. So this is when weather, so water, wind, ice, or any even just changes in temperature can actually break down rock or pieces of land. So there are two different types of weathering that we have talked about, and I really want to review them right here, right now. So first we talked about mechanical weathering, or we might also call it physical weathering. So mechanical weathering is when the actual rocks are just being broken down into teenier, tinier pieces, usually by like a physical force coming in and breaking up that rock into smaller pieces. So there are different ways mechanical weathering can actually happen. One way can be that ice wedging. So that is, if you look at this GIF down here, when cold water fills in like a crack in the rock, when it freezes, that ice can expand or get bigger, which can cause that rock to break apart and fall into smaller pieces. So since it's being broken into just smaller pieces, that is physical weathering. You can also have root growth, which I don't really have a picture of it here, but a root from a plant can enter the crack of a rock just like the ice did, and once that plant grows into that crack, it can do the same thing, break it down into smaller pieces. So that's also physical force, mechanical weathering. The last one is abrasion. Abrasion, just a fancy way of saying something's hitting that rock enough and enough until finally it just can't take it anymore and it breaks down. So like over here we've got wind and rain hitting this piece of rock till eventually it just gives up and it breaks off and falls down into a different spot. So that actual rock falling off, that is that weathering. If you look here, the sediment being carried into a new location, this part here would be that deposition, right? Because that sediment is being laid down and adding on to the earth. So this part of the video or GIF, whatever, is technically constructive, but the actual breaking off of the rock up here, that is destructive because it's destroying it, breaking it down into a smaller piece. So those are all mechanical weathering examples because again, you're just breaking down the rock into smaller pieces. The other type of weathering, I think it's a trickier type of weathering, but we're going to get it, is chemical weathering. Chemical weathering. So the difference between mechanical and chemical is chemical weathering is when you are actually changing the literal chemicals that make up the rocks. So something is happening where the rock or soil or dirt or whatever is totally changing into something new. So you usually have to add something to the rock for this to happen. So this can be an example with like acid rain, which is as scary as it sounds. So if there's a lot of like pollutants or pollution in the air or bad chemicals in the air, it can cause sometimes when it rains to be more acidic. So there's literally more acid in the rain. That's kind of scary. So the acid rain, once it hits certain types of rocks, it can have like a reaction, a chemical reaction with the rock and literally change the chemicals that make up that rock. So that's going to break it down as well. So that is still weathering. If you see anything about a change in pH, which the pH scale, I honestly don't remember if you learned this in 6th grade or not, but you don't need to know this in detail. Don't let this intimidate you. Just know that the pH scale is like a measure of how much acid is in something. You can take the pH of pretty much anything that's made up of chemicals, which is pretty much anything. So if you have like more acid in something, it's going to be more acidic, so we give it a lower number, but if there's less acid, we call it basic, so it has a higher number. So if you see anything about a change in the pH, that just means it's the change in how much acid is in something or in the rock. So that would be another example of chemical weathering. And lastly, we have that oxidation, which we talked about, just literally the oxygen in the air reacting with the chemicals that make up the rock or the soil. And you can see examples of that in like old cars. If you see like stuff like this happening to the paint job of like an older car, that's oxidation. The oxygen is actually reacting with the paint on the car, causing it to look kind of weird. So the same thing can happen to rocks and landforms. The oxygen in the air can react strangely with the chemicals in the rock, causing it to change color. So they're all being broken down by chemicals. The chemicals that make up the rocks are actually changing. So that is chemical weathering. So mechanical, they're just getting smaller. Chemical, they're actually changing what they're made up of. Okay, here's your cheat sheet. I really like this cheat sheet. It's a good one. I know I say that all the time, but I really, really like this one. This explains, okay, what type of processes are constructive, what are destructive, and what's both. And they also list different phrases you might hear in a question that's going to tip you off to know, okay, they're talking about a constructive process here or a destructive. So if you see anything about something being created or built up or deposited, that's constructive. If you see anything being burned or broken down, carried away, worn away, that's totally destructive, okay? Same thing with your types of weathering. I just listed again the examples of both, of chemical and mechanical, and again, some key phrases you might hear to help you know that that's what the question is talking about. So for chemical, if you see anything about acid or becoming more acidic or more basic, that's the opposite of acidic, talking about chemical. Or if you see any type of element listed, like carbon, oxygen, sulfur, iron, anything, they're probably talking about chemical weathering, okay? But with mechanical, again, if you just see something about the rock being broken down into smaller pieces or worn away, whatever, you're talking about mechanical weathering. Okay, so don't forget we have your small piece of independent practice. It's only 2 little sections, real easy. This very first example here, like it says for each scenario, you're going to type a C on the left if the sentence is describing a constructive process, so we're building up the earth, or you're going to type a D if it is a destructive process, meaning you're breaking down the earth. So like if you look at this very first sentence, it says the stream of a river causing erosion and wearing down nearby rocks. So if you look at your cheat sheet, that's what it's there for, we see wearing down and we see erosion. So those are key things that are jumping out at us to help us know this is the destructive process. The earth is being broken down here. So I'm going to type a D for destructive. So you're going to do that for the rest of these sentences. And this last bit here, it says label each scenario below as either chemical or mechanical weathering by typing its number in the appropriate box. Okay, so we're going to take the number that is labeled for each sentence and type it underneath either chemical, if it's chemical, or mechanical, if it's mechanical. So like this very first example here, it says acidic water moving through rocks reacts with some of the minerals. So we see the word acidic. And remember, looking at your cheat sheet, acidic is a key thing that's going to be used for chemical weathering. So I'm going to put number 1 underneath chemical. And you're going to do that for the rest of the examples. Pretty easy. Once you are finished, don't forget to do your exit ticket. It ain't too difficult. And you can use your cheat sheet on your exit ticket. So like, don't play yourself. Come on. Answer the question correctly. And then justify your answer. And then you are done for the day. Enjoy your weekend. Hit me up if you need any help. You've got this.